Good afternoon from Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street, Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jeff Helgeson, talking today about a group of Russian writers whose work pretty much captured the evolving soul of that country since the era following the Napoleonic Wars. To start, Alexander Pushkin, who, like the French novelist Alexandre Dumas, was partially of African descent, has largely been acknowledged as the founder of Russian literature. Having lived from 1799 to 1837, when he was killed in a duel, Pushkin essentially established a template followed by other Russian writers in terms of a tendency towards introspection. Over time, that tendency led to the development of intellectual themes relating to philosophy and religion, psychology, social and economic disparities, political corruption, and, ultimately, revolution. Writing in a highly structured poetic narrative form, somewhat like England's Lord Byron, although having developed his own 14-line stanza, Pushkin, as did the French novelist Henri de Balzac, addressed himself to exhibiting the post-Napoleonic era, its true soul divulging. Reputed to have seduced over 100 aristocratic women, not counting housemaids and the attractive daughters of a number of serfs, Pushkin appears to have incorporated aspects of his own life in the work that is acknowledged to have been his masterpiece, Eugene Onegin. Within this novel in verse, a provincial, engaged to be married young woman becomes intrigued by her fiancé's arrogant new friend from St. Petersburg, causing a quarrel between the two men that ends in a duel in which the jaded, confirmed bachelor kills the angry fiancé and is forced into a prolonged self-exile from Russia, after which he once again meets the sister of the woman whose betrothed he had killed, Titania, whose expressions of affection he had previously rejected, and declares his love for her. But she has since married, so declining the suggestion of an adulterous elopement, she sends the dejected, sadder, but wiser Onegin away, each knowing that they will never meet again, and demonstrating some of the emotional cost of snobbish urbane arrogance. The young nobleman, like his fictional creation, Alexander Pushkin, as observed by Avram Yamalinsky in an introduction to the Heritage press publication of Eugene Onegin, mirrors the gradual sobering down of his own life within this work, bidding a firm if wishful farewell to his youth and greeting the onset of middle age before being fatally wounded in a duel with his own wife's lover, who was also her sister's husband. Still, the work Pushkin created fulfilled the ambition which its author set for it, the mind's reflections coldly noted being expressed through bitter insights of the heart, and subsequently inspiring Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky to create an operatic version of the Onegin story in 1879, and then a 1999 motion picture featuring Ralph Fiennes and Liv Tyler, the daughter of Aerosmith lead singer Steven Tyler, as well as inspiring the Elfman Ballet of St. Petersburg to mount a 2009 version using music composed by Igor Stravinsky. Pushkin additionally wrote the novella The Queen of Spades, that also became the basis for an opera by Tchaikovsky, as well as the verse play Boris Godunov, which, when it was finally approved by the censors some 50 years after its author's death, inspired Modest Mussorgsky's only completed opera, as well as the name for the 1960s cartoon antagonist of Rocky and Bullwinkle, Boris Badenov. Further inspiration provided by Pushkin was a suggestion that he made for the plot of Nikolai Gogol's 1836 comedic play, The Government Inspector. In it, a petty Russian official who has lost all his money gambling is mistaken for a much more important government agent, exploits the situation, in addition to seducing the daughter of the town's mayor, before borrowing a large sum of money and quickly leaving just as the real inspector arrives. Although Tsar Nicholas is said to have enjoyed the play and asserted, "Everyone has received his due, and I most of all," other officials appear to have been a little less amused, causing Gogol to go into voluntary exile due to fear of reprisal, writing such works as The Diary of a Madman, The Overcoat, and his novel Dead Souls, about a corrupt Russian businessman's scheme to use the names of deceased serfs in order to fraudulently obtain bank loans while safely outside of the country. Before leaving, however, appearing in Pushkin's literary journal, The Contemporary, Gogol published an absurdist short story titled The Nose, dealing with a government official whose nose one day separates itself from the man's face and becomes more successful on its own. Commenting about Gogol's work, Pushkin observed, "Behind his laughter, you feel the unseen tears." Later, in 1837, on learning the news of Pushkin's death in the duel with his wife's brother-in-law lover, the poet Mikhail Lermontov wrote, "He fell a slave of tinsel honor, sacrificed to slaughter's lust. The haughty poet's head, the noblest, bowed on his wounded breast in dust." Lermontov's elegy also accused the Russian political elites of being the hangmen who kill liberty, genius, and glory, which promptly got him arrested and sent into military exile in the Caucasus, before later returning to St. Petersburg and writing the first Russian prose novel, A Hero of Our Time, that caused him to become acknowledged as the founder of the tradition of the Russian psychological novel, but then, becoming involved within a duel himself, he was again banished to the Caucasus, during which time he distinguished himself in hand-to-hand combat as a leader of an irregular group of Cossacks, but then provoked a second duel with a former school friend and was shot in the heart and killed in July of 1841. Yet, with Pushkin, Gogol, and Lermontov, a basis for Russian literature had been created, largely in a Western European style. But, like the foundation of a French-speaking Russian nobleman's country manor house, set well within a natural landscape of folk tales, songs, and stories about such historical Russian figures as the 12th century Prince Igor, 16th century's Ivan the Terrible, and then the strongly westernizing Peter and Catherine the Great. Building upon these varying traditions, Ivan Turgenev, with early poems, series of sketches from a hunter's album, and such plays as the comedic A Month in the Country, evolved as a writer to eventually produce a social-political novel with fathers and sons that introduced the concept of nihilism, belief in the absence of meaning in life, explored extreme social-economic disparities, and provided a discourse on the abolition of serfdom in Russia well before that was actually to take place. This book also pretty clearly demonstrated the fact that life goes on for others when its protagonist, perhaps antagonist is a more apt term, dies from an infection he had acquired while providing medical assistance to a serf, and no one but his aged parents take the time to mourn his passing. The son of a retired cavalry officer and a landed aristocratic heiress who ruled over as many as 5,000 souls, as serfs were termed, Turgenev, having fathered a daughter with one of his mother's household servants during his 20s, became infatuated with a married opera singer and followed her throughout Western Europe, ultimately bringing his own illegitimate daughter to be raised in France along with the mezzo-soprano's children. Although the exact nature of this relationship is largely unknown, the acquaintance did bring Turgenev into the company of composer Frédéric Chopin and his lover, the female author in men's clothing who called herself Georges Sand, as well as the writers Gustave Flaubert and Guy Maupassant. Meanwhile, in Russia during the 1840s, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky, who began to suffer from epilepsy, as had Flaubert after his heavily drinking physician father had been murdered by the serfs on his estate, experienced a major literary success with the publication of his first novel titled Poor People, but then became involved in a politically radical plot against the Tsar's government and was sentenced to death by firing squad in 1849, only to be reprieved at the very last ready, aim, fire moment, and then sent for the next 10 years, first to a labor camp in Siberia, and then to serve as a conscript in the Russian army, even though he had been trained as an officer at school in St. Petersburg. Having married a widow while completing his sentence, who died of tuberculosis 6 years later, Dostoevsky had not been allowed to go back into Western Russia until 1859. In 1862, the year after Tsar Alexander II's emancipation of Russia's 23 million serfs, making them merely abjectly impoverished peasants instead, Dostoevsky published a fictionalized account of his imprisonment titled Memoirs from the House of the Dead, and then he completed Notes from the Underground in 1864, the year of his wife's death. Following his return to St. Petersburg, Dostoevsky lived in poverty while writing his novel Crime and Punishment about a young university student named Raskolnikov living in poverty who, in order to finance his intended efforts to benefit the poor, largely under the influence of the end justifies the means utilitarian philosophy, decides to murder an old and unscrupulous pawnbroker in order to steal her money to finance his philanthropic ambitions, but ends up killing both the avaricious old woman and her kindly, innocent younger sister with an axe, eventually confessing his crime to a good-hearted prostitute named Sonia, who had become the sole support of her mother and several younger siblings following the death of her drunkard of a father. Raskolnikov is persuaded to turn himself in. And then, after his trial, with the sun rising above the vast open steppes of the barren eastern Russian landscape, on Easter Sunday, he is accompanied by Sonia to the penal colony in Siberia where he had been sentenced. With Crime and Punishment completed, Dostoevsky had still been under contract to his publishers for a second novel that he ended up having to dictate to a 19-year-old stenographer who he married upon completion of the project, The Gamblers, before promptly leaving the country, but himself gambling away all of his and his new wife's money at roulette tables, consequently being forced to return to Russia, where he subsequently wrote the novels The Idiot, but a kindly but impotent epileptic prince who suffers from his love for an apparently psychologically disturbed younger woman, and The Possessed, story about the calculated conspiracies of social revolutionists, as well as concerns related to justice, guilt, and the consequences of belief or disbelief in God, revisiting Turgenev's notion of nihilism with the idea that one must either accept life without meaning or kill oneself. In 1880, just a few months before his own death the following year, and after making a monument dedication speech in tribute to the memory of Alexander Pushkin, Dostoevsky published what he termed the pinnacle of his literary efforts, the Brothers Karamazov. At well over 900 pages, the book portrays a landowner, the 3 legitimate sons he has had with 2 different wives, and an epileptic 4th illegitimate son who he keeps as a servant, along with the woman who both the father and his eldest son Dmitri sexually desire. Questions of inheritance, problem of evil in the world, patricidal murder, the existence or non-existence of God, human suffering, and the nature of forgiveness dominate the book, and are especially demonstrated by a passage in which the philosophical brother, Ivan, recounts to his monkish younger brother, Alyosha, a prose poem he had written about the return of Jesus during the Spanish Inquisition and his arrest by the Catholic Church and subsequent interrogation. This section of the book, however, was left out of the 1958 film version of the story featuring Lee J. Cobb, Yul Brynner, and William Shatner in his pre-Star Trek Hollywood debut as the younger Karamazov brother, Alyosha. Beginning in the 1880s, around the time of the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, 20 years after having emancipated the serfs, a little like Abraham Lincoln's being assassinated following freeing of American slaves, as well as the deaths of both Dostoevsky and Turgenev, a new level of psychological realism entered Russian literature with the short stories, written for the money they brought in, and over the next 2 decades, the 4 major plays of Anton Chekhov: The Seagull, Uncle Vanya, 3 Sisters, and The Cherry Orchard. Working with director Konstantin Stanislavski at the Moscow Art Theater, Chekhov de-emphasized plot in favor of character and demonstrated the changing nature of Russian society as the 20th century was about to begin. Also, unlike both Dostoevsky and Count Leo Tolstoy, after about as many youthful indulgences as admitted by St. Augustine, Chekhov was a self-confessed atheist who'd observed, once a man gets a fixed idea, there's nothing to be done. It was largely as a result of a set of fixed ideas regarding impoverishment and religion that caused Chekhov to become estranged from the much older Tolstoy, whose massive War and Peace, outlining a view of history that largely dismissed the efforts of great individuals such as Napoleon in favor of the cumulative consequences of events beyond their control, had been fully published in 1869 when Chekhov was less than 10 years old. The 2 writers, eventually meeting in the summer of 1895, according to Daniel Giles' biography of Chekhov. Tolstoy wrote in a letter about the younger playwright, "I like him very much, but so far he seems not to have a definite outlook on life." Of course, it was Tolstoy's outlook on life by the turn of the century, as Giles points out, that estranged Chekhov from him as a result of a social and extreme religious zeal which had caused Tolstoy to renounce his own literary efforts, including such works as the Kreutzer Sonata, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and How Much Land Does a Man Need, as well as the novels War and Peace and Anna Karenina, with its famous opening sentence, "Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." At the same time, Tolstoy gave away his estate to his wife and children just when Chekhov had been in the process of acquiring one for himself. Although Tolstoy outlived Chekhov, who died in 1904, the year of the Russo-Japanese War and the first attempt at a socialist revolution in Russia, dying himself of pneumonia at a train station 6 years later, as was dramatized about a century after that in the motion picture The Last Station, featuring Christopher Plummer and Helen Mirren. It was their mutual acquaintance, Alexander Maximovich Peshov, Maxim Gorky, 1868 to 1936, who led Russian literature into the first part of the 20th century as a supporter of the communist Bolshevik movement that, on October the 25th in 1918, as expressed by Mick Jagger in the song Sympathy for the Devil, killed the Tsar and his ministers while Anastasia screamed in vain. Gorky, by the way, was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature as many as 5 different times without receiving it. Yet, at the invitation of Joseph Stalin, following a period of exile, Gorky lived the final 4 years of his life back in the USSR, where he was credited as having been the founder of socialist realism in literature, although there's also speculation that, like some prominent Russian individuals recently, he was poisoned before quickly being cremated and having his ashes interred within the Kremlin wall. Clearly, however, whether under the authoritarian governance of the Tsars or of the former Soviet Union, it was the nature and soul of Russian society that came to dominate the evolving contributions of that country to world literature, including the Nobel Prizes attained by Boris Pasternak for his Bolshevik Revolution novel Dr. Zhivago, and by Alexander Solzhenitsyn for his penal colony chronicle, The Gulag Archipelago. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois.